Hello everybody, thank you for joining us for another story time today. Today's story is about something very special going on during this time of year that is very special for our region where we live. So this only happens in northern states in the US and parts of Canada, like in Quebec and Ontario. And from about Minnesota, around the Great Lakes, all the way over to Maine. And people in these states are going out right now, going into the woods, and they're putting something on the trees, and they're going to collect something. And then at the end, we are going to get a delicious treat that we can put on our waffles and our pancakes and enjoy at breakfast time. So it is maple syrup time of the year. Right now, people are going out to put, we call them taps in trees, and that goes into the tree, and then when the sap rises up out of the ground it was stored down in the roots during the winter, and it's going to start to rise up the tree as spring comes and our trees are thinking about growing their leaves, and we can take some of that sap. And tree sap is mostly just sugar and water, so when we boil it, we get rid of some of the water in there, and it kind of concentrates or makes it a little thicker and more sugary, and it's a nice sweet treat that we get to eat. We'll talk a little bit more about that process and where you could maybe see it at the end. But for right now, we're going to read our story called Almost Time. It was written by Gary Schmidt and Elizabeth Stickney and illustrated by G. Brian Karras. So maybe, how many of you, I wonder, have ever tapped a maple tree or been part of a group maybe that taps trees and collects sap in these buckets? So maybe this might look familiar to you. When Ethan had to eat his pancakes with applesauce instead of maple syrup one Sunday morning, he knew it was almost sugaring time. So Ethan's pretty sad that they ate up all of last year's syrup. Now he's using applesauce on his pancakes. Is the sap running yet? He asked. Dad shook his head. Not until the days get warmer. That afternoon, Ethan took his sled to the big hill. It was a sunny day, so he left his hat and his scarf and his mittens at home. But the day wasn't warm. Brrr. Next Sunday morning, Ethan's dad made a pan of cornbread. No syrup. Is it time to tap the trees? Ethan asked. When the nights get shorter, Dad said. See Ethan waiting. It's hard sometimes to wait for something you really want to happen, right? At bedtime that night, Ethan thought there might be some daylight still coming through the window. Can you see him up in his window? But there wasn't enough to find Roosevelt. Who do you think Roosevelt might be? He's looking under his bed. Next Sunday morning, Ethan stirred raisins and walnuts into his bowl of oatmeal. No syrup. When he bit down on a walnut, he discovered something. My tooth is loose, he said. His father inspected. I expect it will fall out before long. How long? Asked Ethan. About as long as it takes the sap to start running, Dad said. Oh man, now Ethan has two exciting things to look forward to. Now Ethan had two things to wait for. You can see him wiggling his tooth. But the days were still cold, and the nights were still long. And his tooth would not come out. The next Sunday morning, Ethan's dad made eggs and toast. Ethan tried not to think about maple syrup in the afternoons when he slid down the big hill, or when he turned on his lamp at night, or when he wiggled his very loose tooth during school. Until what happened? His tooth came out. His dad was waiting when he got off the bus. "How's that tooth?" he asked. Ethan smiled to show him. "So is the sap going to run now?" asked Ethan. His dad smiled to show him. Every afternoon that week and all day Saturday, Ethan and his dad hauled buckets of sap from the trees and tended the fire beneath the pans. So you can see them. They've tapped the trees, and underneath the tap, they hang a bucket to collect the sap. And then when the buckets are full, they bring them into these pans, and they have a fire going underneath to boil off that extra water and turn it into syrup. You can see they have to keep tending to the fire to keep it nice and hot. So the sap, which is kind of clear colored when it comes out of the tree, and the more water they boil out of it, more of that water evaporates from the sap, and the sugars, like I said, get more concentrated, and then the syrup gets darker and darker and darker. So they're tending the fire beneath the pans. As the sap boiled and boiled, you can see it's starting to change colors. And then what are they doing? And early on Sunday morning, when there was already a little light in the sky, Ethan poured sweet maple syrup on his pancakes. We see some other signs of spring in this photo too. Robins and flowers are coming up. Oh, finally. Ethan's so happy he had syrup at breakfast again. Okay. So spring is a really exciting time for people who like to get sap from their trees and turn it into syrup. I will put some resources with our story time. If your family is interested in learning more about this, there's a couple of different options. First of all, I'll post a winter tree guide. It can be kind of hard to identify trees when they don't have their leaves this time of year. So if your family wants to go out in your yard and see if you have any maples, this guide will help you identify a maple even when it doesn't have its leaves. So maybe you want to try tapping a tree this year if you have one and see if you can get any sap out of it. For collecting sap, they call it when the sap is running, that means it's coming out of the tree. And for that to happen, we want it above freezing during the day and below freezing at night. So I've heard from some friends who have tapped maples this year that it's we call a slow run, meaning not much sap is coming out, because for a lot of people, we're just not getting cold enough temps at night, especially down here in the driftless region. But other people have posted that they're having a pretty good run. So it just might depend on where you are and what kind of weather you're having this spring and when you tap your trees. Okay. There's also tons and tons of different places in Minnesota and in Wisconsin that produce maple syrup, and often you can go visit those places and see their facilities and how they do it in the process. And also, a lot of our regional parks, state parks, or nature centers will do maple syrup demonstrations in the spring. So they'll show you how to tap a tree and how they collect the sap and how they boil it down. And then if you're really lucky, they're going to give you some breakfast and you get to try out the maple syrup on your breakfast. So I've put together a resource list where you can find those kinds of events during this month in March. And you can also find, maybe you want to switch and start buying your syrup from somebody who makes it locally, or maybe you want to go visit their farm, and I've put a resource in there to help you find those places too. So check out the resources and activities. Thank you for joining us for Storytime, and I hope you get outside a bunch this spring, even if it's not to tap maples and it's just to enjoy all the other signs of spring that we're seeing. I'll see you again in 2 weeks for Storytime. Bye-bye.